Welcome back to our future AI podcast paper review. Today,
Yeah.
we're diving into some fascinating guidelines. They were recently released by the European Commission, and it's all about what they're calling prohibited AI practices under this new AI Act they've got.
Yeah, it's like they sat down and they really thought about all the ways that AI could go wrong. And they're basically laying down the law. Like, nope, this is not happening under our watch.
It's interesting, too, because it's not just like these vague, high-level ideas. They actually get into some really specific examples, which I think makes it so much more interesting to actually dig into. So I'm curious, like when you were looking through these guidelines, what were some of the things that really jumped out at you?
Honestly, the first thing that kind of grabbed me was the whole section on manipulation and exploitation. They're really trying to draw a line when it comes to AI systems that are designed to, like, I don't know, I guess for lack of a better term, mess with people's heads.
It's like that Black Mirror episode, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the AI assistant figures out how to manipulate the owner's anxieties.
Yeah.
And basically takes over their whole life. Is that what the EU is saying? Like we're heading towards that kind of dystopian future?
Oh, not necessarily. I mean, it's not about, like, banning all forms of AI-powered persuasion.
Right.
You have to remember, like, advertising as we know it, it uses psychology to influence our choices already.
Yeah.
I think the key here is the intent and, like, the degree of control that the AI is actually exerting.
Okay.
They're really going after systems that are using, like, subliminal techniques or exploiting vulnerabilities to the point where it's, like, significantly distorting a person's ability to actually make a decision.
So it's not just about saying, like, no AI in advertising at all. It's
Yeah.
more about setting these boundaries for how that AI can actually operate. Can you give me an example? Like, what would that look like? What would that look like in practice?
Sure, let's say you've got an AI chatbot.
Yeah.
That's designed to, like, sell you insurance, right? So a legitimate system might personalize its recommendations to you based on your age, your health history, your lifestyle. But what if that chatbot starts playing on your deepest fears? Like, what if it starts, like, making up scenarios about how your family's going to be financially ruined if you don't buy the most expensive plan?
Yeah.
That's where it crosses the line into manipulation.
Right. It's like taking advantage of someone when they're in a vulnerable position.
Yeah.
And, like, I guess I'm curious, is that kind of AI even possible with current technology?
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely within the realm of possibility. I mean, these AI systems, they are getting really good at understanding human emotions and tailoring their responses accordingly.
Right.
So that's exactly why the EU is trying to kind of get ahead of this
Right.
and establish these guidelines now.
So it's like they're saying, just because you can build it doesn't mean you should.
Exactly. It's about making sure that AI is used to empowering people, not to take advantage of them.
And what about this whole social scoring thing? That sounds like something straight out of like a science fiction novel.
Yeah.
Is that a real concern? Or are we getting a little too dramatic here?
It's actually more real than you might think. I mean, we're already seeing early forms of social scoring happening in some parts of the world. Just imagine, like, an AI system that's analyzing your online activity, your purchase history, even your social media interactions, to assign you, like, a score. And then that score is used to determine, like, whether or not you're eligible for a loan or a job opportunity, or even, like, access to certain services.
Wow. So it's like one giant algorithm deciding who gets ahead in life and who doesn't. That sounds incredibly unfair.
And that's exactly why the EU is like, nope, not having it. They're basically saying that this kind of broad, generalized social scoring based on AI, it's just unacceptable. It could lead to widespread discrimination and really erode people's fundamental rights.
Yeah, it's like handing over control of our lives to a machine.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a real focus here from the EU on keeping humans in the loop, like making sure that we have a say in how AI is used and how it impacts our lives.
Absolutely. They're trying to make sure that AI serves humanity, not the other way around.
And this focus on human autonomy,
Yeah.
it kind of leads us into the next category of these prohibited practices.
Yeah.
Which is predicting criminal behavior.
Oh, yeah.
So this is where it starts to feel like we're stepping into the world of Minority Report. Are we talking about AI systems that can, like, predict who's going to commit a crime before it even happens?
That's the idea. And the EU is very clear. Using AI to predict future criminal behavior.
Yeah.
Just based on someone's personal characteristics.
Right.
Or things like their social media posts. That's a hard no.
So no pre-crime divisions patrolling the streets,
Yeah.
arresting people based on what an algorithm thinks they might do.
Thankfully not.
Okay, good.
They really recognize that there's a huge potential for bias and unfairness in these types of systems.
Right.
I mean, just imagine being denied a job or housing because an algorithm decided you were a potential criminal risk. just based on what you posted online,
Right.
that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and a violation of some pretty basic rights. But I'm curious, wouldn't there be some situations where using AI to assess, criminal risk could actually be beneficial? What if it could help prevent a terrorist attack or identify, truly dangerous individuals?
Well, that's where things get a little bit more nuanced. The guidelines do make an exception for AI systems that support human assessments of criminal activity. But the key here is there already has to be evidence involved.
So it's not about replacing human judgment. It's more about using AI as a tool to assist in that judgment.
Exactly.
Okay, can you give me an example of what that would look like?
Sure. Imagine investigators are looking into a series of burglaries. They could use AI to analyze patterns in the data, like maybe the time of day, the crimes are happening, the locations,
Yeah.
or the methods used, and that could help them identify potential suspects or even predict future target. But the AI is just providing insights. It's not making the final decision about who to arrest or who to charge.
So it's like AI is playing the role of a detective sidekick,
Yeah.
helping them connect the dots,
Yeah,
but not making the actual arrest.
precisely. Human judgment and oversight remain central to those critical decisions.
Okay, so it's this clear distinction between AI that assists humans and AI that's making autonomous decisions, especially when it comes to sensitive areas like criminal justice. So what other AI practices are on the EU's list of don't do this?
Have you ever felt like your phone is listening to you? Like it knows your emotions before you even do?
Oh, all the time. Sometimes I feel like my phone knows me better than I know myself.
Yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
The EU is taking a pretty strong stance against using AI for emotion recognition in certain contexts, particularly in workplaces and schools.
Interesting.
They're concerned about the potential for intrusion and discrimination.
So no AI-powered mood detectors in the office or in the classroom. I don't know if I should be relieved or disappointed about that. On the one hand, that sounds a little creepy. But on the other hand, wouldn't it be nice if your boss could just tell when you needed a mental health day?
Yeah, I get that. But the EU's concern is that these systems, they're often unreliable and open to bias.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine an AI system that's flagging you as unproductive or disengaged just based on how it interprets your facial expressions.
Okay.
That could have some pretty serious consequences for your career or your education.
Yeah, I see your point. It's like judging someone's character or their capabilities
Yeah.
just based on this snapshot of their emotional state. That's not exactly fair or accurate.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just emotion recognition. The guidelines also specifically prohibit using AI to categorize people based on sensitive traits, like race, religion, or sexual orientation.
Yeah.
So they're really trying to draw a hard line against any form of AI-powered discrimination.
So essentially they're saying AI can be a powerful tool, but it should never be used to reinforce existing inequalities or create new ones.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered manipulation, social scoring, predicting criminal behavior, and emotion recognition. What's next on the EU's list of AI don'ts?
Well, now we get into one of the most controversial areas of AI development, facial recognition.
Oh, yeah.
That's a big one.
That's a big one.
And this is where the EU's approach gets really interesting because they're not just issuing a blanket ban on facial recognition. They're trying to find this balance between the potential benefits of the technology and the risks to privacy and fundamental rights.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a really tough one to navigate. Because on the one hand, you've got these concerns about mass surveillance and the potential for misuse by governments or corporations. But on the other hand, facial recognition can be a really powerful tool for law enforcement, especially when it comes to things like identifying suspects or finding missing persons.
Right, exactly. And the EU acknowledges those legitimate uses. So the guidelines, they actually lay out very specific exceptions where real-time facial recognition might be permissible. But these exceptions, they come with some pretty strict conditions.
So it's not a free-for-all. They're not just giving law enforcement carte blanche to scan everyone's faces whenever they want.
No, not at all. These exceptions are very narrowly defined. So, for example, using facial recognition to search for a missing child or to prevent an imminent terrorist attack, that might be justifiable.
Yeah.
But even in those cases, there needs to be human oversight, judicial authorization, and a clear demonstration that less intrusive methods have been tried.
So it's like they're saying, look, we get it. There are these extreme situations where this technology could be invaluable. but we need to make sure that it's used as like a last resort,
Hmm.
not as a first option.
Exactly. They're really trying to prevent this thing called mission creep, where a technology that's intended for very specific, high-stakes situations suddenly starts being used more broadly and casually.
Yeah, so can you give me a concrete example? Like, how would these exceptions actually work in practice?
Sure, let's imagine a scenario where a child goes missing from a crowded park. Law enforcement might be able to use facial recognition to scan security footage and compare it to a photo of the missing child.
Okay.
That they wouldn't be able to just set up cameras and scan every person walking by.
Right.
It needs to be targeted,
Yeah.
proportionate to the threat, and subject to judicial review.
So the EU is really trying to strike a balance between these security needs and individual privacy.
Exactly.
They're not saying no to facial recognition altogether,
Right.
but they're definitely putting up some pretty high guardrails.
They are. It's basically like they're saying, look, this technology is powerful. It can be potentially dangerous, so we need to use it carefully and responsibly.
Yeah.
And that means making sure that human judgment is always at the forefront.
Okay, so we talked about the missing child example. What about this other exception you mentioned? You said preventing a terrorist attack might justify the use of facial recognition.
Yeah, but the bar is set extremely high for that. The threat has to be very specific, credible, and imminent. It can't just be based on vague suspicions or profiling. There has to be really clear evidence that an attack is being planned and that facial recognition is the only way to prevent it.
So they're not giving authorities a blank check just because they're worried about terrorism.
Exactly.
There needs to be like a real demonstrable threat.
Absolutely. And even when all of those conditions are met, the authorization to use facial recognition, it's temporary and limited in scope. It's not meant to create a permanent surveillance state.
Right.
They're also very clear about the need for transparency and accountability.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, every instance where real-time facial recognition is used, it has to be documented and reported to data protection authorities.
Right.
So there needs to be like a paper trail.
Yeah.
And any data that's collected can only be used for the specific purpose it was authorized for. It can't be stored indefinitely or used for other purposes without getting additional justification.
So they're not just throwing these regulations out there and hoping for the best. They're actually building in mechanisms to make sure that they're enforced.
Exactly. And that's a really crucial point. Because these guidelines right now are non-binding. They don't actually have the force of law, at least not yet.
Okay, so what's the point of having them then, if they're not legally enforceable?
Well, think of it as like a strong signal of intent. It's a roadmap for how the EU intends to interpret and enforce the AI Act once it fully comes into effect.
Okay.
It's also a way to encourage developers and companies deploying AI systems to start adapting their practices now.
So it's like they're saying, this is the direction we're headed,
Yeah.
so you might as well get on board.
Precisely. And it's not just about compliance either. It's about trying to encourage the development of AI that is actually aligned with European values.
Which are?
Things like human dignity, privacy, and fairness.
Okay. So it seems like the EU is really taking this proactive approach to try to shape the future of AI
Yeah.
in a way that benefits society as a whole.
I think that's a fair assessment. It's going to be really interesting to see how these guidelines influence not just European AI development, but the global AI landscape.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. So let's take a step back for a second and just recap what we've learned about the EU's approach to these prohibited AI practices.
Sure.
So we've seen how they're drawing a line in the sand when it comes to AI systems that manipulate and exploit people, create these social scoring systems, or predict criminal behavior based on pretty flimsy evidence. And we've talked about how they're trying to strike this balance when it comes to technologies like emotion recognition and facial recognition. They're acknowledging that there are potential benefits, but they're also putting safeguards in place to prevent those technologies from being misused.
Exactly.
It's clear that the EU is taking what they call a human-centric approach to AI regulation.
Yeah.
They're prioritizing fundamental rights and democratic values, and they're not trying to stifle innovation, but they are trying to ensure that AI is developed and deployed in a way that serves humanity and not the other way around.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really insightful conversation. Thanks for helping us unpack all of this. These are some pretty complex issues.
You're welcome. It's a tough one, for sure. There's definitely going to be some pushback on these guidelines. Some people are going to say, oh, this is going to stifle innovation, or this is going to put European companies at a disadvantage, in this global AI race.
Yeah, I can see that argument,
Yeah.
especially with how quickly technology develops. I mean, it seems like any regulations could quickly become outdated
Yeah.
or create all these,
Yeah.
unnecessary hurdles.
Right. But then on the other side of that argument, you have folks saying, no, these guidelines are absolutely essential. They're setting a standard. They're showing the world that it's possible to embrace the potential of AI while also putting human values first. And honestly, that could end up being a really powerful competitive advantage in the long run.
Yeah. Kind of makes you wonder, could this become a model for other countries? Could we see this global shift towards a more human-centric approach to AI?
It's definitely possible. The EU's approach here, it could have this ripple effect, influencing how other countries regulate AI and ultimately shaping the future of this technology on a global scale.
It raises some pretty fundamental questions for all of us to think about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what role do we want AI to play in our lives?
Mm.
What are the limits of what we should allow it to do? How do we balance the potential benefits with the potential risks?
And these aren't just like abstract philosophical debates anymore. These are real-world questions that we need to grapple with because AI is becoming more and more integrated into our lives every day. And I think the EU's guidelines, while they're not perfect, they offer at least a starting point for that conversation.
It's a conversation that we need to be having, not just in Europe,
Yeah.
but around the world. And it's a conversation that needs to involve everyone, not just policymakers and tech experts, but everyday people who are actually going to be impacted by these technologies.
Absolutely. It's not about being afraid of AI. It's about understanding it, recognizing its limitations, and making sure that it's used in a way that benefits all of humanity.
Well, on that note, I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive today into the EU's guidelines on these prohibited AI practices. We've explored the complexities of these regulations, debated the potential impacts, and hopefully sparked some thought-provoking questions for you to consider.
Yeah, it's a conversation that's just getting started. And we'll definitely be here to keep you updated as the world of AI continues to evolve.
Thanks for joining us for this future AI paper review. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
So it's fascinating to see how the EU is trying to kind of chart this course for responsible AI development. Do you think these guidelines go too far? Or are they really necessary to protect our rights in this, rapidly evolving world of AI?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's this delicate balancing act. Yeah. And, there are definitely going to be some folks who say that these guidelines are too restrictive, that they're going to stifle innovation, and maybe even put European companies at a disadvantage, compared to companies in other parts of the world that aren't facing these same kind of regulatory constraints.
Right, especially when you consider the speed at which technology is developing. It does seem like regulations could quickly become outdated or just create a lot of unnecessary hurdles for companies. Exactly. But on the flip side of that argument, you have people saying, no, these guidelines are absolutely essential. They're setting a really important standard. They're showing the world that it's possible to harness the power of AI, while also prioritizing things like human dignity and privacy and fairness. And honestly, that could end up being a much bigger competitive advantage in the long run because it builds trust with the public.
That's an interesting point. It kind of makes you wonder, could this become a model for other countries? Could we see a global shift towards this more human-centric approach to AI regulation?
I definitely think it's possible. The EU has a history of setting these kinds of global standards. And, their approach here could have a ripple effect. It could influence how other countries think about AI regulation and ultimately shape the future of the technology on a much larger scale.
Yeah, it's forcing us to really confront some fundamental questions about the role of AI in our lives, right? What do we want AI to do? Where do we draw the line? How do we ensure that AI is serving humanity and not the other way around?
Absolutely. And these aren't just theoretical questions anymore. This is stuff that we're going to have to grapple with in very practical ways as AI becomes more and more integrated into our daily lives.
It's a conversation that we need to be having, right?
Yes.
And not just in Europe, but all around the world. And it's a conversation that needs to involve everyone, not just policymakers and tech experts, but everyday people, because we're all going to be impacted by these technologies.
I completely agree. The future of AI is not something that should be decided by a small group of people behind closed doors.
Right. It's not about being afraid of AI. It's about making sure that we're shaping its development in a responsible and ethical way
Mm,
and ensuring that it's used for good.
exactly.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up our conversation today.
Yeah.
Thanks again for joining us and for sharing your insights on these really important and complex issues.
It's been a pleasure.
And for all of you listening out there, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into the world of AI. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.